All right, everyone, it is now noon. Welcome to our third Monday Moo on health and housing needs of cattle. Just a few announcements before we get started, before I turn it over to Sarah. This session will be recorded, so she'll probably announce when she starts that recording. You can type questions in the chat box. And if you don't know how to work the chat box, if you're viewing from a laptop or a computer, if you go down to the bottom of your screen and move your cursor around, it'll show all the different functions. And if you click on chat, that'll bring up the chat. If you want to see the chat along with the presentation, if you go to the top right, you can exit full screen and it should bring up the PowerPoint presentation as well as the chat box. If you can either ask the question in there and post it to everyone. If you prefer not to post it to everyone, please, you can send it directly to a co-host. So what I'll ask for this session is to send that to Rachel Slattery. If you're just going to private message that question, send it to Rachel, one of our co-hosts, because she will be handling the questions for these sessions. And if you have any problems, let us know. If your question is complicated, there should be a function. If you find yourself, you should be able to do a raised hand or send us a message and ask us to unmute you at the end, and we can allow you to ask your question. If it's going to be something long or kind of complicated, where you might need to give some clarification, that might be the best option. So again, you can always private message us, and we can unmute you. Rachel's posted the link that will be hosting today's recording as well as all the previous recording that is on our UMD webpage, and it's under Beef Extension Resources. So that link is in there. If you can't find it again, just send me an email. You can respond to your confirmation email and it'll come directly to me. If you can't find any other emails for our presenters and co-hosts, but you can send that to me and I can forward that on to you if you're having a hard time with copy and paste. Because you can click on it directly from the chat box, but I wouldn't recommend doing that until towards the end, because it may, depending on what pops up, mine will pop up in a different browser, but if it pops up in the same browser, it might disrupt your connection. And I think that answers all of the questions we have so far. There will be, like as in the other ones, there will be 2 polls at the end. The first one, I'll give you about 5 minutes to complete that, and I'll start that while we're going through questions. If that poll gets in your way and you need to see something on the screen, you can use your mouse to drag that poll to a different part of your screen or minimize it once you're finished after you submit it. And then the second poll I'll leave up a little bit longer because it's a little bit more complicated, but the same questions that we've had in previous ones. We just need to evaluate how many people attend these presentations, a little bit about where they're from, and I do see somebody told us where they're from in the chat box. So if you're not, we can only put so many locations in the chat or in the polls, because otherwise it would be a never-ending poll. So if your location is not listed and you wish to share that with you, we love that, to have that information. So stay tuned for those at the end, and we do value your feedback on these. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Potts to introduce herself and finish the introductions and get us started.
All right, thanks, Megan. As Megan said, I'm going to be talking about health and housing needs of cattle. My name is Sarah Potts. I'm an extension specialist with University of Maryland. I've been in this position for a little over a year now, and my specialist area of expertise is dairy and beef cattle. Also on the call is Rachel Slattery, and she is in dairy and beef extension in the Department of Animal Science with University of Maryland, as well as Jeff Semler, who's also on the call. He is our ag extension agent for Washington County. So the 3 of us will be fielding questions at the end. As Megan said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we will answer those at the end. As Megan has said, we are going to be recording this presentation, so it will be posted later if you have to dip out early, or if you have someone that you know wants to watch it, or if you want to watch it again, the link for the recording will be in the chat box as well. So going into health and housing needs of cattle, I'm first going to talk about housing basics. So some things you need to think about for basic housing are things like the feeding area, the watering area, as well as shelter. And what that is going to look like on your farm is going to vary depending on what your management style is. So for feeding areas, again, that's going to depend on the feeding strategy that you are implementing on your farm. If you are using pasture as your sole feed source, you're going to be needing very few structures, physical structures for your feeding area. You generally want to incorporate some sort of structure for mineral feeding. And if you are incorporating some sort of supplemental feeding, or if you are housing in confinement, where you are providing all of the feed to your animals and they're not relying on pasture, you are going to have some sort of designated feeding area and some sort of feed trough, manger, or hay feeder if you're feeding hay. And in those situations, you will want to consider spacing for each animal if you're limit feeding or if you're free choice feeding. So we'll talk a little bit more about feeding strategies for pasture versus confinement here shortly. For waterers, generally you have two different types of systems that you will consider. Either a permanent watering system, which obviously is, as it sounds, is permanent, and it's going to be installed in areas where animals will have access to. The deal with permanent watering systems is that they do require a bit of management around the system. So you have to be able to manage the manure or mud buildup that will happen around the system. For temporary watering systems, these are usually useful for our rotational grazing management herds or just pasture-based herds in general, because you can actually move them around if you need to. But the important thing to remember with water is that animals should always have access to fresh water at all times. So feed obviously is important, but water is very important. Animals will die of dehydration faster than they will die of starvation. In terms of shelter, the important thing to remember about shelter is that it can help animals stay comfortable. In hot weather, we're often thinking of helping them stay cool, so that could be providing some sort of shade for your animals. This chart here is showing the temperature humidity index for beef cattle. It's a way we can assess how stressed animals are going to be depending on the temperature as well as the relative humidity outside. So in this table, we have any number that's less than 75. We're not considering those animals to be heat stressed. But as the number gets above 75 and approaches 84, animals are going to start becoming heat stressed. So you see a number above 85 or 84, you're going to have animals that are severely heat stressed, and those animals really should have access to some sort of shade or some way to cool themselves down so they don't have severe health, long-term health implications. So in Maryland, we typically, summer days, typically 85, 90 degrees, and it's no small feat for it to be, 50 or 60% humidity, and you've automatically got cattle that are going to be in that moderate heat stress zone. So that's just something to consider, especially during our hot summers, and especially during the hotter portions of the day, is whether or not the animals have access to some sort of shade. During the winter time, we think about sheltering animals from the cold to keep them from getting too cold. This is especially important for our younger animals, like young calves. Not only do they not have a lot of body fat stores to keep themselves warm, but they also don't have fully functioning rumens yet. And the rumen does provide the animal with another way of getting warm. That fermentation that happens in the rumen produces heat and helps keep them warm. So in colder weather, we're really thinking about providing a windbreak or some way to get the animals out of the wind, but also providing a dry or mud-free area so the animals can stay dry. So these two figures here are showing how the animal's overall energy requirements change depending on environmental conditions. This top one is showing the temperature at 20 degrees versus 75 degrees. And if there's a lot of wind, so say it's not a lot of wind, but if it's 15 miles per hour wind, you can see that these animals are going to have a lot higher energy requirements than these animals here. And the reason why that matters is that in order to meet those energy requirements, those cattle are going to have to either eat more food, or they're going to either lose weight or not gain as much weight. If we look here, this is just a little bit bigger of a difference here. The animals, it's windy, but the animals are also going to be a little wet and muddy. And if that's the case, they are going to have a much larger difference in terms of how much energy they're going to need to maintain their basal body condition or body temperature. So again, shelter is important during cold as well as the heat of the summer. So I mentioned what types of housing you're gonna need. It's gonna look different depending on the type of management system you have on your farm. So there's two major types of management systems we generally think about. There's gonna be pasture-based systems as well as confinement-based systems. And then a third type of option is going to be a combination of both pasture as well as confinement systems. A good example of a combination system would be someone who raises their animals on pasture for 3/4 of the year, but in the wintertime, they bring them into either a confined facility or a lot or something like that, and they feed hay and silage and things like that because there's not pasture available. For the different types of management systems, here I've just listed some things you need to consider specifically for each of the systems. So for a pasture system, you're going to need to consider land availability, fencing, as well as water, shelter, and whether or not you're going to have feeders available to your animals. For a confinement system, generally nobody with a confinement system, we don't usually forget about considering housing and shelter, but you also need to think about feeders and waterers, as well as manure management, and potentially fencing, depending on whether or not the animals do have access to the outdoors. So we're going to start talking a little bit about pasture. And there's a variety of different pasture systems that folks will use. The simplest method is a continuous grazing method where the animals have access to the entire field or pasture at one time. In this instance, you're going to need at least, we recommend generally at least 1 acre per 500 pounds of animals. So for a mature cow, you're going to need about 2 acres per cow. Then we go into a little bit more complex management systems where we have simple rotational grazing, where you divide that pasture, that big pasture, up into some smaller, what we call paddocks, and you basically will keep the animals in one paddock for a certain period of time and then move them into the next paddock. And then we can get even more complicated or complex and do this with, divide it further into smaller paddocks and just rotate the animals more frequently. So the reason why folks will opt to use these intensive grazing management practices is that it does improve forage yield and persistency. So it does allow you to actually increase the number of animals per acre on your farm because it does increase that forage yield. It also improves soil health and fertility, as well as manure distribution across the field, and also can help improve weed control. And although it does require a bit more planning and management in terms of, you know, separating out the pastures and figuring out when to rotate the animals, it will reduce, oftentimes reduce the reliance on supplemental feeding. So you might not need to feed as much hay or grain throughout the year as you would if you were just using a continuous system, because you are increasing the forage yield by doing these practices. So that's why a lot of folks will utilize this intensive grazing management systems. But there are some considerations that you need to think about in terms of housing as well as feeding and watering if you do these types of systems. For pasture-based systems, you need to be thinking about fencing, obviously, because your animals are outside and you need to keep your animals in the field. There are 2 major types of fencing. There's permanent fencing as well as temporary fencing. Permanent fencing can vary. There's many different options, including high tensile fencing, which is shown here. There's woven wire fencing as well as board fencing. Permanent fencing is nice for like the entire perimeter of the whole field. And then temporary fencing can be useful when you're implementing those rotational grazing management practices that I mentioned in the last slide. It's sometimes useful to put a piece of barbed wire or electric fencing along the permanent fencing, because these animals sometimes will push against some of the permanent fencing and cause damage to the fencing, and that can be a real headache to have to fix often. So that's something that you can implement if you're having issues with that. Again, temporary fencing is useful for our intensive management or intensive grazing management practices. We have things like polywire, which is just a single wire. You can also double it up and put 2 wires if you've got animals of different sizes. So if you have cow-calf pairs, you might consider putting a double wire so that the calves don't sneak under. Poly tape is very similar to polywire. Again, these are going to be temporary fences, so these are just basic step-in posts, or you can either hammer them in. They make different types. You can just step in. There's also net wire, which is often a lot of times used for small ruminants. But the thing with temporary fencing is that it does have to be electrified in order for it to be effective, because again, it's just a single wire. You don't have, you know, several boards keeping the animals from going where you don't want them to go. Next, looking at different waterers. There's different types of waterers you can pursue, and this is just, there's more than even there are on this slide. But there are two basic types. Again, there's the permanent, and then there is the non, or the temporary or non-permanent types of waterers. The permanent fixtures, again, you need to be considerate of the manure or organic matter buildup. These two types of waterers here have been situated so that they will service two different groups of animals, so that they're in a fence row, so you can actually supply two groups. But the important thing to remember with all of these waterers is that they don't run dry, and you need to make sure that you are looking at how much water they will supply for a given period of time, to make sure that the number of animals you have will have enough water at all times. For our temporary or semi-permanent waterers, we have troughs like these. These are really useful because you can dump them out and move them throughout the pasture, even if you're not doing a continuous system, or sorry, a rotational system. With a continuous system, you can still move these around, so you don't have, you don't destroy parts of the field just by keeping the water in one place all the time. In terms of shelter, for our pasture-based management systems, we often will think about either man-made shelter or natural shelter. For man-made shelter options, we often have barns, we have lean-tos or sheds. This facility here has a windbreak here on the side because that's where the wind will come from, but it also has a roof. And then for our natural shelter, we have trees, which can be really useful, not only for providing shade, but also for providing a windbreak in the colder weather. If you do have man-made shelter that's going to be high use at times, so if it's really rainy for a couple weeks, or if it's really cold and snowy, again, you're going to need to consider how you're going to manage the manure and mud buildup in that area, and how you're going to actually keep it as a dry area, and so the animals do stay dry. For our confinement-based management systems, for shelter, a lot of folks will adapt an old dairy barn, which will work just fine as long as there's sufficient ventilation. Some folks will use a hoop barn, as is shown here, or a pack or a compost barn, or even a dirt or an open lot. The important thing to remember with a confinement-based system in terms of shelter is that you need to make sure that there's enough floor space for each animal. A lot of folks will oftentimes overlook this. So to put this in perspective, if you are housing cow-calf pairs in confinement, it's generally recommended that you have at least 100 square feet of space for each cow. Now, smaller calves, if you have weaned stocker calves or replacement heifers, etc., they're going to need a little bit less space than that. But again, that's something that you need to consider if you are going to be going the confinement route. In terms of feeding facilities for our pasture-based systems, generally, again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, you're not going to need a ton of facilities for feeding on pasture unless you're giving a lot of supplemental feed. Generally, you can get by with a mineral feeder. A lot of times you just have a simple free choice mineral feeder. This is an example of one here, where the cattle can just go and consume mineral on their own accord. If you are going to feed hay for a portion of the year or all year, we do recommend that you invest in some type of hay feeder. Now, it can be a permanent structure like this, or it could be a semi-permanent structure that can actually be moved elsewhere if you choose. The reason why we recommend a hay feeder is that you can feed hay on the ground, but if you feed hay on the ground, you do run the risk of wasting a large portion of that hay. So hay feeders can definitely help minimize the waste of feed there. And if you tune into our What the Hay series, I'm sure our pasture specialists will talk about ways to minimize hay loss. For our pasture systems, if you are using supplemental feed, you should consider using a feed trough or some type of manger so that you can deliver that supplemental feed. This is an example of a makeshift feeder here that is used to feed calves, but you can use any kind of feeding manger. And something like this is really nice because you can also, like the portable hay feeder, you can move it around the field if you'd like to. For our confinement facilities for feeding, obviously you're actually going to need to have some access to a feed manger or trough, because those animals are not going out to pasture to get their feed, that you are providing it to them. If you are going to be feeding hay to those animals, free choice or what have you, that's, it's not in this ration that they're getting every day, we do recommend that you do, again, purchase some sort of hay feeder to minimize that waste. Something that you need to consider with confinement feeding is bunk space, or space at the feeder per animal. So generally with confinement feeding situations, and even in some pasture supplemental feeding situations, you're oftentimes just going to be feeding once a day. So in those situations, all of the animals need to be able to come up and eat at the same time. So you need to make sure that there's enough space to accommodate that. To put that in perspective for you, a mature cow would require at least 2 feet of space, whereas young calves are going to need at least 1.5 feet of space, again, to make sure they can all eat at the same time. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about in terms of facilities for housing, feeding, and watering, and then we're going to segue into the health requirements for cattle. And a nice way to kind of bring that together is to talk a little bit about handling facilities, because that's not necessarily a housing facility, but it is really important to health management of the animals. So handling facilities are really important to facilitating routine health management. So vaccinations, examinations, providing parasite control, as well as breeding and pregnancy checks if you are a cow-calf operation. They're also important for non-routine health management practices. So if you have an animal that gets injured or is sick, they provide a way to restrain the animals in a safe way that you can actually treat the animal properly. So there are 4 main components of a handling facility. There's a head gate, a chute, and then the alleyway or the snake where the animals are going single file, and then there's the loading tub. So generally the animals will come into the loading tub if there's a group of them, and then they will essentially file single file through the snake or the alley, go into the chute, and then they will be caught at the head gate here. Let me just back up. So I have starred these 3 components here, the head gate, chute, and the alley, because those are the most basic components that we recommend having to facilitate safe treatment of animals in terms of health procedures. So the head gate is the end of the system where it restrains the head, and it prevents the animal from lunging forward or pulling back. And this is really helpful if you are administering a vaccine or doing anything up here to this portion of their face. It keeps you safe and it keeps them safe as well. The next part of the facility is the chute, and that's this portion here. Again, this is the head gate and this is the chute. The chute prevents the lateral or the side-to-side movement of the animal. Again, it keeps them from jumping around if you're doing anything, either at their head or at their back end, etc. And some chutes will actually have a squeeze function to help adjust the width. So if you have, this is a pretty large animal, but if you have a younger calf that comes through here, you can use the squeeze function to narrow it down a bit so that their side-to-side movement is also restricted. And then the last essential component is the alley. And that's, again, the part of the facility where the animals are going to start moving single file, and will help move them single file towards the chute and the head gate. In a perfect world, these would be solid-sided, but it's really not essential if you only have a few animals, or, we'd rather you have something in place rather than to be worried about perfect world things. But a few gates would suffice. I mean, this one's pretty well developed, but if you only have a couple of animals, a couple of gates on either side of the chute would also be functional as well. So some routine health management procedures for cattle. There's vaccinations, there's deworming, there's fly control, and we're going to talk quite a bit about these 3 procedures here. And then there's some other things that are more management specific, depending on the type of animals you have in your facility. So there's breeding procedures, pregnancy check, dehorning and castration, as well as implanting. So breeding and pregnancy check obviously are pertinent to cow-calf producers, as well as dehorning, castration, and implanting. Those are more pertinent to folks that have calves on their farm. So in terms of vaccinations, just to go through a few basics, the type of vaccine that you're going to administer to your animal is going to depend on its age, stage of production, as well as your own management goals and what you want or interested in vaccinating the animal for. So it's really important that you do develop a relationship with your veterinarian to help you develop a specific protocol that will work with your system. Most vaccines are going to require not just an initial dose, but also a booster periodically. So some will be annual, some will be more frequent than that. A lot of vaccines will come in what we call a multi-wave form, where one drug or one administration will provide defense against several different pathogens. A good example of that is the respiratory vaccine that we oftentimes will give to calves. And there are two major types of vaccines available. So there's a killed vaccine, where the virus is killed and it has no residual activity. And then we also have what we call a live or a modified live vaccine. And the reason why I mentioned that is that it's important to know which type of vaccine you're working with, because certain live vaccines, for example, should not be given to pregnant cattle because it can induce abortions and they can lose their calf. So it's really important to check the label, not only for indications as to what type of animal the vaccine should be given to, but also for the dosage as well as the method of delivery. Some vaccines should be injected into the muscle, some vaccines are injected under the skin, and some are administered either orally or other routes of administration. So it's important to read the label. For calves, there are a couple common vaccinations that we generally recommend. There's the respiratory disease mixture of vaccines that we often recommend vaccinating for, including BVD, IBR, PI3, and BRSV. And again, this oftentimes comes in a multi-way vaccine. So it's one injection. You're not, giving 4 injections to vaccinate for all of those diseases. And we also recommend a clostridial vaccination as well. So for calves, a lot of times folks will vaccinate their calves at 2 to 5 months, pre-weaning and at weaning, or at post-weaning. So some combination of those are just the 4 main common times that folks will wean or will vaccinate their calves. Again, depending on the protocol you develop with your veterinarian, will dictate when you will actually when you should actually vaccinate your calves. For cows and bulls, and these are for animals that are going to be maintained for breeding purposes, there are a couple of common vaccines that are often given, things like leptospirosis, the respiratory diseases, similar to what we just mentioned with the calves. There's also clostridial vaccine that you can give. And then vibriosis and trichomoniasis are also vaccines you can give to your cows, but those are generally more important if you are if you have cows with bulls. If you are using a bull to breed your cows, you should consider vaccinating your cows for these two diseases here. And a lot of times these vaccines will be given pre-breeding, so between 30 to 60 days before the breeding season begins. All right, now shifting into dewormer and parasite control. So the purpose of providing a dewormer is to provide defense against internal parasites. So this is especially important for cattle that are exposed to pasture, because that's where the parasites they need pasture to complete their life cycle. The economically important parasite that we're concerned with in cattle is called the brown stomach worm. It's not a parasite that's going to necessarily kill your cattle. It's not like in sheep where parasites can actually kill the animals very easily. But it will reduce average daily gain significantly. And so a lot of times these reductions are subtle, so you might not notice them, but you will have reduced average daily gain, and you'll have reduced feed efficiency of your animals, and that can have economic implications. Control of the internal parasite is really important especially for our younger animals, so those that are less than 2 years old. Older animals oftentimes will develop some sort of immunity to the worms, so they can kind of deal with a higher parasite load than a younger animal can. So we recommend performing what we call selective deworming, where you only deworm vulnerable animals and those with a high parasite load. And this is to help prevent the development of drug resistance in our parasites. You can determine what animals have a high parasite load, or if you have a high parasite load in certain groups of animals on your farm, by taking a manure sample and submitting it to a lab, and they'll count the number of eggs in that manure sample to give you an idea of what the parasite load is. There are a couple different drugs available for deworming, but the two most commonly used in cattle are in two different classes. They're benzimidazoles as well as macrolytic lactones. So the first class, the benzimidazoles, would include things like Safeguard. And then the macrolytic lactones include things like ivermectin, doramectin, and moxidectin. And that includes things like Dectomax, Cydectin, etc. For those of you who need common names. And these drugs can be administered in a variety of different ways. Some of them are pour-ons, so you can apply them down the back of the animal. Some of them are injectables, so you would inject them either into the muscle or subcutaneously. And then some of them are orally administered either as a feed additive, a drench, or a paste. Now with the feed additive, it is important that that the animals do consistently consume the appropriate dosage, and that can be the tricky part with the feed additive. They're effective only when they're given in their proper dose. So if the animals aren't eating enough of it, or if some animals are getting too much and others aren't getting enough, you're not going to have effective control. Moving into some of our external parasites, I'm going to talk mostly about flies, but this could also include things like lice and ticks as well, that are also annoyances as well as disease transmitters in cattle. For our fly types, we have our face fly, which is a non-biting fly. It's usually found around the eyes, nose, and mouth of the cattle. This fly will generally feed on the secretions around the face. And not only are they annoying to the cattle, but they also can transmit pink eye, which can have obviously animal welfare issues, but also economic impacts as well. The horn fly is the next fly. It's a biting fly that's usually found on the back and belly of the cattle, as shown here. And this is considered to be the most economically important fly in cattle production in the US. So it's really important that we do try and control those on our animals. And then the last fly that's of importance to cattle is called the stable fly, and they're oftentimes found around the front legs of the cattle. And a lot of times you'll see cattle with stable flies, they'll be stomping their front legs trying to get the flies off of them. So not only do these flies potentially transmit diseases among the animals, but they also create a lot of annoyance for the cattle, and they create they make the animals exhibit avoidance behaviors. And that can actually reduce average daily gains and cause economic impacts that way. There are several methods available to help you control flies with your cattle. There's no right or wrong way, or you can, and it's oftentimes most effective to implement a variety of different control methods to achieve the level of control that you want. So there's chemical methods, which would include things like back rubbers or dust bags, as shown in these two pictures here, where there's an insecticide in the device and the animals rub against it, and the insecticide is applied to them as they rub against it. These two types of fly control methods are most effective when they're in a quote unquote forced use area. So what that means is that the cattle actually have to go under it or touch it to get to, say, a waterer or a feeder of some sort, making sure that all cattle do touch it at some point during the day. There's also fly tags, those which is shown here. Those can be effective for horn flies as well as face flies. Those are a popular choice for a lot of producers because you put them in and you kind of forget about it. But generally you do have to make sure you do apply them appropriately for adequate control. You do need to put a tag in each ear, and you do need to make sure that all of the animals in a group are treated. Otherwise, you're not going to have adequate control. So that means if you have cow-calf pairs, both cows and calves need tags. And the tags sometimes do lose their effectiveness throughout the season, so you may have to apply them later. later in the season as well. And the important thing with fly tags too is that in recent years, there's been a lot of resistance issues. So you should rotate the type of drug class you use in each fly tag, or in the fly tags, from one season to another. There's two other types of fly control methods. There's a pour-on, which is very similar to the dewormer type pour-on, and as well as an oral larvicide that you can feed to the cattle as well. Like the oral dewormers, it's also important to make sure that the cattle are consuming the appropriate amount so that you can have adequate control of your animals. If the animals aren't consuming enough of it, you're not going to have effective control. So some non-chemical fly control methods. You can clean up organic matter accumulation. This is particularly important around shelters, high use areas like around waters and feeders, because that is a breeding ground for a lot of our flies. And then also there's some research going on with the use of parasitic insects and wasps and things like that will prey on the larvae of the flies and help control the fly populations that way. Going into some of our special management procedures, I'm going to talk specifically about dehorning and disbudding as well as castration. So for dehorning and disbudding, I just want to first start out the discussion by talking about how some breeds are naturally polled or hornless. And examples of those breeds would be Angus or polled Herefords. There are others out there, I'm sure. And then there's also breeds that do grow horns naturally. So those are most of our dairy breeds like Holsteins, Jerseys. This is a picture of a brown Swiss with horns. Charolais and horned Hereford are also beef breeds that do grow horns as well. So without going into too much genetics, basic biology and basic genetics, the polled gene is actually a dominant gene. So when you breed a horned cow to a polled bull, so say an Angus bull, the offspring will most likely be polled. I say most likely because we know that the animal has to have two, the animal, if that's polled, may actually only have one gene copy of that polled gene. So I can't say always polled, but there's a high likelihood of use of a polled calf being the result of a horned cow made of the polled bull. So not only is the Angus breed used in crossbreeding programs to improve carcass quality and marketability and things like that, but also it has the advantage of introducing that polled trait into your herd as well. So some of the questions we often will get for dehorning and disbudding is, why do we do it? The first thing is safety. So not only for handlers, but also for other cattle. And the second reason is for management facilities. So cattle with horns generally are going to require either more space per animal or different types of facilities to accommodate their larger width of their head. And then product quality also kind of comes back to safety of other cattle, because if you're transporting cattle or there's cattle that are kind of housed in close quarters for short periods of time, if they have horns, they're more likely to damage or bruise each other's carcasses. The next question we will get often is, when should we dehorn or disbud? If you do generally we recommend before 8 weeks of age. And if it's performed before 8 weeks of age, it's called disbudding. And that's because the horn bud has not yet attached to the skull. After 8 weeks, it's called dehorning because the horn bud is actually attached to the skull and it actually is what we call the horn at that time. So we recommend disbudding before 8 weeks of age because it is a less invasive procedure at that point. There are a couple of different methods that can be used for dehorning or disbudding. The most commonly used method is the electric or gas cauterizing iron. And this is a lot of times used for disbudding. So again, it's performed before that 8-week mark. And this is the picture shown here, where basically you're using heat to damage the horn bud tissue and so that it doesn't grow. You also have the option of using what we call a caustic paste, and this is gaining quite a bit of popularity, especially in the dairy industry, where the paste is applied to the calf's horn buds a couple days after birth. You do have to put some sort of, I see people use a lot of tape or some sort of device over where you put the paste so that it stays in place and it doesn't run down into the calf's eyes or anything like that. But that is a pretty effective way of disbudding as well. And then for dehorning, a lot of folks will use what we call scoop dehorners, where they basically have to cut the horn out. And that, again, is after 8 weeks of age, when the horn bud is actually attached to the skull, and that's for older calves. In terms of pain management, we recommend using a local anesthetic during the procedure. This can be applied with like a simple nerve block on either side of the calf's head. This is shown here. It's a pretty simple procedure. If you apply the anesthetic a couple minutes before you do the dehorning or disbudding procedure, the calf generally will have good numb. It will numb the area pretty well, and the calf won't feel the pain. We also recommend using some sort of anti-inflammatory drug for after the procedure, so that the animal has some sort of way to deal with the pain afterwards. Sometimes this can, I do want to point out that this can be off-label drug usage in some cases, so it's important that you do seek veterinary guidance for doing that, for providing the NSAID after the dehorning procedure. The last management practice we're going to talk about is castration. So one question we'll get a lot of times is, why do we do it? It's mostly for from a product quality standpoint. Animals that are castrated will have more marbling in their carcass, as well as their carcass will be a little bit more tender. It's also a safety issue. Those animals that are castrated generally are easier to manage. They have reduced aggression. They're not going to break stuff as readily as an intact bull will. And that kind of goes along with management ease. And then the next question we'll get, well, which animals should we castrate? So if you have male animals that are not intended for breeding use, we generally recommend castrating them. And then generally we recommend castrating as early as possible. Some folks will elect to castrate later in life, so closer to weaning time, because they think that the animals will grow a little bit better, a little bit faster. And that may be true in some cases, but overall research has suggested that the lifetime growth advantage of delaying castration is actually minimal. And those animals that are castrated later in life are more at risk for infection and things like that. So there are a couple of different methods of castrating cattle. There are bloodless methods as well as surgical methods. The bloodless methods generally will result in less acute pain or less short-term pain, but it will oftentimes result in more chronic pain. Whereas the surgical methods will generally result in more acute pain, but less chronic pain. So it's that's part of the reason why some folks will choose one type of method over another. For the bloodless method, the most commonly used procedures will be something called the emasculotome, which will basically crush the spermatic cord in the scrotum, which will cut the blood supply off from the testes. And then we have the elastrator here, which will do a similar thing, will basically cut the blood supply off to the testes by putting a band around the scrotum there. The trick with doing these bloodless castration procedures is to make sure that both testes are below where you are castrating, to make sure that you don't end up with an animal that has one testes still intact. With a surgical procedure, you can use a knife, or you can use something called the emasculator, which is shown here. Again, it will cut, and then this has a crimping feature here to help stop the bleeding after you do the cut. And again, we do recommend doing this as early as possible, again, to minimize stress on the animal. So to summarize our talk today, our housing needs are going to vary depending on your management goals and the type of system that you have on your farm. There's no one-size-fits-all scheme that's going to work for everybody. And you should be paying special consideration to how feed, water, and shelter will be provided to your animals, given what facilities you have available and what your goals are. A handling and restraint system is very important for routine as well as non-routine health checks and procedures on cattle. And it's important to establish a relationship with your veterinarian to help you develop schedules for health protocols such as vaccinations and deworming and things like that. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we will answer them now.